Hi, welcome to session 3 of the fourth topic of the semester titled Popular Reform Movements. We're looking at a period of time in U.S. history, roughly speaking, from 1890 to 1920. And during this period of time, we're going to see certain sectors of society becoming quite active politically, people coming together, of course, and helping each other create associations, groups that will serve them to actually pursue certain objectives that geared towards reforming, of course, bringing about reform, the political and economic system. So again, this is a period of time in which we're going to see the rise of certain popular movements. For example, the agrarian movement, something we already covered in session 1. The movement of farmers, the American farmer, is going to be one particular group that is going to become highly organized and politicized due to certain, again, conditions, certain factors, certain obstacles that prevented them from actually achieving success in this new economy, in this new industrial economy. And as they're becoming very organized, they're going to create a national movement called the agrarian movement that will have national representation. All farmers, all American farmers were actually represented again on a nationwide by a national association called the National Farmers Alliance. And of course, this is going to be very helpful in presenting a series of goals or objectives that this movement was pursuing, that farmers believed that achieving those reforms were going to bring, again, about the desired change that will enable them to succeed in the system. In this new market economy, they really wanted to succeed, again, as producers. They wanted to succeed as commercial farmers, but again, they experienced a series of problems that we already covered, of course, very thoroughly in session 1. And of course, they created their own movement. Of course, the industrial workers are going to also constitute a separate sector of society that is also going to become highly organized and politicized in terms of also coming together, forming their own associations called trade unions, for example. That will also, by the 1880s, are going to create a national organization, the American Federation of Labor, as they were called, that will embrace all of the trade unions of the United States in order to also propose a series of goals, a series of objectives, reforms that they believe were going to better the life of the worker, both at the workplace, but also in terms of his social or her social life as well. So we cover that quite thoroughly in session 2. And at the end of session 2, we were looking at the creation of a third party called the People's Party in 1892 with the alliance of farmers and workers. Again, those two national movements we have seen, the agrarian movement and the labor movement, are going to create a temporary alliance in the late 1990s. So, well, it's going to, again, in 1892, they're going to actually create a party, and they're going to pretty much carry out their party politics throughout that decade with the intent of competing with the two main parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, to gain seats in Congress, to gain seats at the local level, at the state level. And as we'll see in 1896, they're going to actually nominate a candidate to compete for the presidency, of the United States in 1896. So we see now the formation of a third party. Again, this is the party of farmers and workers that are going to blend their demands, their reforms into a single one. And this is what the third party is going to pursue. The elected officials of this party, this is what they're actually going to try to bring about, in terms of legislation, the kind of laws, the kind of bills that they're going to push in where they serve, whether they're serving in Congress or they're serving, as governors, etc. Whatever seat they can, whatever post they can actually win, they're going to use again the office to try to bring about reform. That is to say, so let's look then now at our slide to continue then our discussion of the third party called the People's Party. That is based on this idea of populism. Again, we talked about, of course, that populism is a political philosophy that states that people should be engaged in politics in a more direct way, and not just by voting and electing our representatives, our leaders in office every time there's an election, but rather that people should do the politics themselves, that people should be able to write legislation, vote on legislation, that the ordinary person that is not very prestigious, that has no wealth or no business, also should gain political access again to positions of authority at the local, state, and federal level, and carry out reforms as well. Again, so it's a more direct kind of participation of the people in politics. That's what populism is. Again, so this was the central philosophy of the People's Party that is going to dominate. Again, the activism is going to dominate the ideology of this third party. This is what this third party pretty much represented. And as I said, but in 1896, the People's Party is going to now compete in the presidential elections of 1896, and they're going to build an alliance with one of the two main parties to increase their chances of actually winning this election. So this is a very important election, one of the most important elections in U.S. history. Is not the most important, by the way, but it's a very important election, as we'll see in just a second. And of course, this third party, the People's Party, is really trying to push for reform in the United States, trying to implement, again, the policies we discussed in the second session, like the silver currency, the regulation or ownership of railroads, for example, and the like, a shorter work week, and so on. And they really believe that the quickest way to bring about change and bring about reform is if they win the presidency. Okay, so this is the highest office in the land. And so if somebody represents the farmers and the workers at the level of the presidency, they believe, then that person was going to use that office in order to further, of course, the ideals, the objectives of the party, push for reform. That is to say, that it will be faster, in other words, to implement those policies for change. So in this election, again, the Populists, or the People's Party, they were known as the Populists, by the way, they're going to build an alliance with the Democrats. The idea is, well, if we run by ourselves as a third party, we're just, a newly created party. We're just created in 1992. So the leaders of the party didn't see themselves actually as having a very good chance of winning the election. But if they unite their forces, if they unite their numbers with the Democrats, they said, if we build an alliance, that will increase our chances again of winning. So after all, the Democratic Party is one of the main established parties in the country. They have a large, of course, popular base that supports the party, and a great many, again, of the people that vote Democrat, not all of them, but a great many, are farmers in the U.S. South. So, so they believed that the Democratic Party, ideologically, philosophically, had more in common with the populists than the Republicans. Again, so the populists will say, well, after all, the Democrats do have in their philosophy, the ideas of uh, natural rights philosophy, again, the ideas of self-rule, life, liberty, and property, and so on, that, back in this time was more appealing to the populist, of course, than the ideals of the Republican Party. So they're going to come together, build the alliance, and they're going to nominate a candidate that was appealing to both the populists and the Democrats. His name was William Jennings Bryan, and he's coming from Nebraska. Again, this is an agrarian state. This is, again, an agrarian state per excellence. He was actually born in a farmer's community. He came out of this environment, again, of farmers. And of course, he's going to, at some point in his life, leave the farm for the city. He become highly educated. He was a highly educated man, by the way. And so he understood then the plight, the problems of the farmers. And he also understood workers just because he had migrated to the city. He had spent a number of years there. So he knew both worlds. Okay, that he could connect again with the farmers. He could speak in the language of the farmers, but at the same time, he will speak very eloquently, very articulate. That also people in the city could actually connect with them as well. Okay, so he was very charismatic, highly charismatic, to the point that his charisma came more from a certain religious background of his, in that he really projected himself as a sort of preacher, a religious pastor, etc., a minister of sorts. Even though he was also an intellectual, highly educated, nonetheless, in terms of his religious views, he was quite conservative in terms of his religious views and his background as well as a farmer, of course. So he was charismatic. So therefore, he was a natural populist. In other words, here it is, somebody that is coming from the people, from below, again, from the masses, again, that he has, of course, acquired skills, acquired knowledge. He's well prepared as well, but he is one of the people, in other words, and he's very popular because of the way he speaks, the way he speaks as a politician, like a preacher. So people could connect on an emotional level with him as well. So he's running on a joint ticket, again, as a populist and a Democrat simultaneously. So again, this is a coalition. This is an alliance of two parties built into one, again, an alliance to run for the presidency of 1896. So after a series of deliberations as to what the campaign was going to be centered on, the leaders of the Populists and the Democrats decided to center the purpose, the objective of the campaign and the presidency, if he was to win the presidency, on the idea of silver currency. So this is the kind of idea that united the base of the populist, the popular base, the base of support, that is to say, of the Populist Party and the Democratic Party. A great many were farmers and also workers. And what really brought them together was the idea that, well, if we, print silver dollars, if we use silver to create more money, to increase the money supply, we can increase wages, so that will better workers' lives, and they will have more money, more incomes, and so on. And also, silver money was going to be used to finance the commercial investments, the commercial operations, and so on of the farmers, and so they can acquire everything they need, of course, so they don't lose their farms, so they don't become tenant farmers, and so on. So that was the idea, that this is going to benefit, in other words, both. And it was decided that, well, maybe this is going to work if we run on a free silver campaign. This is the slogan of William Jennings Bryan, again, campaign free silver. And of course, he crafted a speech, a very memorable speech that he recited on several places that he visited. That was called the Cross of Gold speech. It was a political speech that sounded more like a sermon, something you will hear from an evangelist, for example, during Sunday service. A very passionate, very emotional speech that actually described, for example, the plight of the poor or the oppressed, the people that were suffering because they didn't have any money. In other words, the poor. In other words, in very general terms, whether they were farmers or workers, etc., that the reason why they were poor is because there was a lack of currency. So therefore, because we don't have free silver, we don't have silver dollars, therefore, what he's saying is that the masses of humanity are being crucified under the cross of gold, on a cross of gold, because we only use the gold standard. Again, that was the idea, that because we only use gold to print money, therefore we're depriving the masses from, of course, earning a living and having a decent life, etc., or experiencing economic success just in general. So he reduced everything to silver, that all the problems of the United States could be solved only if we just, add silver dollars to the country, to the economy. So this is something that they believed was going to work, and it was a speech that was highly emotional, and it appealed to the emotions of the masses. So that's very important. Again, this is an emotional message. There's not a lot of intellectual elaboration here. Okay, so William Jennings Bryan is not really analyzing the economy. He's not really explaining to the people, why the economy is the way it is, and poverty and so on, because of gold or lack of silver. It's just, appealing to the emotions, again, of the masses, not the intellect. That is to say, so this is not meant for people to understand a certain message intellectually, but rather to feel, okay, a certain message. That is to say, so that would be perhaps, the downside of his campaign, is that it was successful in bringing along a great number of farmers with them, and perhaps a certain sector of the industrial workers, although not all of them. But he failed to win the middle class. Okay, and without the middle class, it will be very hard to win elections. And this is going to be a lesson learned, of course, not only here in the US, but pretty much, again, wherever there is a large middle class, or where you have a significant number of people that belong to the middle class, and you have a democracy going, you need their support. Okay, you need the support of the middle class. If you don't campaign and try to win the middle class, it will be very difficult to govern, because the middle class are not going to support, the candidate during the elections. They're not going to write positive articles, for example. They're not going to endorse them in terms of trying to explain to the public why this kind of candidate is the best that we need, etc. So this is the educated sector of society, and also this is the sector that has economic means, economic power as well. So you need the support of the middle class. You cannot just rely again on getting the poor on your side without building some form of links with the middle class. Okay, so that's going to be the downside of William Jennings Bryan, despite of his appeal of his emotional appeal, of his popularity, he's not really bringing along the middle class. The Republican candidate, William McKinley, is. He is bringing along with him the middle class. Middle class, of course, are people that live in the cities for the most part. So the most populated regions of the country are the industrialized states, particularly the cities. This is where most people live now. Remember, we have talked about that. Okay, the shift from the countryside, from the farm to the city. So most people in the U.S. at this time, the late 19th century, live in cities. So you need to campaign there, and you need to campaign heavy on the cities, in the cities. And you need to talk to the middle class. Yes, you need to talk to the workers. It's true. You need to bring them along. You need to talk to the farmers, but you also need to bring along the middle class. So McKinley was, again, kind of just campaigning heavy on the cities. And then he's actually coming from an industrial state, Ohio, heavily industrialized sector of the country. And the way he's going to craft his campaign is to tell the middle class that to keep going in the system that we have been going. It's called capitalism. That is to say that what we need is more investment. We need to create more jobs, etc. We need to expand our industrial base, export more, and so on. And he really made the campaign of William Jennings Bryan looks kind of simplistic, like free silver, for example. So his own campaign slogan kind of encapsulated that, in that he was telling people, look, in this election, you're going to have two choices, and the choice is either you're going to vote for prosperity to keep the system, in other words, that we have, capitalism, or if you vote for William Jennings Bryan, you're going to vote for poverty, because he just wants to create a paradise for the poor, a poor's paradise, in other words, just to attend the needs of the poor and nothing else, the poor sectors of society, that is to say, and forgetting about the rest of the country and just looking at the poor and nothing else. Do we want, again, prosperity, or do we want poverty, in other words? So it resonated with the middle class, because the middle class kind of understood that that's what actually was happening with the Populist, with the People's Party, that it was just going so much grassroots. It was so much appealing just to the masses below, that it was forgetting to look at all the other sectors of society, like the middle class, for example. The shopkeepers, the lawyers, the merchants, for example, the people of high culture, the academics, for example, the writers, the manufacturers, etc. Again, it's a wide variety of different people. So in 1896, in the election, therefore, is going to be a quite close race, a very close race. And this is the closest that a third party has ever gotten, again, in winning a presidential election. It was so close that it will be contested. The votes will have to be recounted in several states of the country. And again, this was a very close race that the Democrats and Populists together build a significant number, an alliance that embraced a significant number of people across the country that almost captured the presidency. Almost. They were so close. And again, this was mind-boggling during this time, because traditionally the United States has always had, ever since the beginning, a two-party system that, for the most part, has been maintained. There was, of course, certain times that one party dominated more than the other, etc. But again, for the most part, it has been a two-party system. And third parties, even though have come about from time to time, they never really represented a serious competition to the two main parties. But in this election, what we see is that this third party really represented a serious competition to the two main parties that even though, of course, this third party was just formed in 1892, uh, and it was not that large to speak of, even though it was still small, it was still very new, it almost had, again, the ability of appealing to a great number of people, to bring so many people to its organization, to endorse it, and almost win the presidency in only 4 years of existence. Only 4 years. It was born in 1892. So this is, again, a very important election in U.S. history, because what this presidential election represented, in a nutshell, was that when people went to vote in 1896, they were not just voting for two different candidates. Okay, it was not just William Jennings Bryan and William McKinley. People understood that they were voting for two different paths of development, two different visions, two different economic visions for the future of the United States. We were about to enter the 20th century, and so the question is, how are we going to go into the next century? What kind of economic system will be best to provide prosperity, to provide opportunities for all? And so when people went to vote, they knew that those two choices represented two different roads altogether. Okay, one road was offered by William Jennings Bryan, okay, the third party candidate that had an alliance with the Democrats, by the way. That all of the ideas of this third party were believed to be ideas of socialism, that we were going to be moving into a whole different economic system. If William Jennings Bryan will win and he will implement his reforms, we were simply going to take the socialist route, again, in which the state will have a greater and greater participation in the economy. The state will regulate businesses, and it will create social programs and so on and so forth for people. And at that time, the middle class was not very supportive of that, of socialism, just because this is an ideology that was alien or foreign to the United States. Socialism was born in Europe. It was finding a great reception in Europe by many people. It was becoming quite popular, socialism in Europe, in different places of Europe. But here in the United States, people just, again, the middle class particularly, were not so attractive to that, because they prefer to stay on the track of capitalism that offered individuals the opportunity to own property and to create what is called free enterprise. In other words, you're going to own the property, you're going to open an enterprise, and you're going to run it, according to how you deem most proper and most effective. Again, most necessary. Again, it's free enterprise. It's yours. So you're going to manage it the way you want. You're going to produce the number of products that you want, etc. And again, there will be no obstructions to that. So it's called economic liberalism. Again, capitalism was actually known as economic liberalism because it gave people the freedom to actually pursue their own self-interest, own property, and build their own, private enterprise in a kind of, in a free way. So the middle class was most attracted to that path. So therefore, this was a very important election that people were deciding the future of the country. And of course, this is something that was best represented in this play, The Wizard of Oz. In this play, of course, what we see is in the characters of the play, the main characters, Dorothy, for example, the Tin Man, the Scarecrow, the Cowardly Lion, those are the main actors, again, of this saga that we just explained. The rise of populism, for example, in the United States, in the presidential election of 1896. Each one of those characters represented one of those social groups Dorothy was the daughter of farmers who were affected by the tornado that destroyed their property. It was very common for farmers to suffer that. And the Scarecrow represented the typical American farmer, and the Tin Man represented the industrial worker. And William Jennings Bryan was represented there in the play as the Cowardly Lion. He was the candidate running for the Populists, and the Populists were the Scarecrow and the Tin Man. The Tin Man and the Scarecrow are going to come together under the leadership of William Jennings Bryan to capture the presidency. And of course, their journey was to reach the Emerald City. The Emerald City was Washington, D.C. So this whole adventure, this whole journey was the road to the White House. Again, they were all trying to get to the White House again in this campaign. That is the idea, of course. The Wizard of Oz is the president of the United States. So in a certain sense, they all wanted the presidency. They wanted to talk to the president. The president was seen as a wizard. The Wizard of Oz is at the ounce of gold. The O and the Z represents an ounce. Again, the ounce of gold. Gold being, of course, the basis of money. So the Wizard of Oz means that is the person in charge of money, of currency, and using currency to solve problems. And each one of those characters had problems. The Tin Man lacked a heart, that he was robotic. The industrial worker lacked emotions because he was mechanical, doing work mechanically, in other words. He needed change. He needed to become human. Okay. The Scarecrow, well, there was, of course, a bias there in the play. The Scarecrow lacked a brain. And again, that was the bias of the author, by the way, in which the bias against the farmer, particularly somebody from the city, a middle-class individual, was that the farmers lacked vision. In other words, a grander vision of what the country needed, in other words, because the farmer was only concentrated on the farm and only the things that affected the farmer, that is to say. Okay. And the Cowardly Lion here is William Jennings Bryan. And the reason for that is because after the presidential election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan is going to quit politics for no apparent reason. He could have continued campaigning, even though he lost the election. He was very popular, very well known, very charismatic, and so he could have just continued building alliances, appealing to the middle class, building a wider movement. But he just quit politics altogether, and many people saw that as cowardly. In other words, why are you so? You are a lion. You are the king of politics at this point. Nobody's more popular than you, but then you quit. Why? You have like a cowardly heart or something like that. So again, people grew very disillusioned at William Jennings Bryan just because he could have continued again and become president in 1900 if he wanted. Again, he could have just become the next president of the United States. So this is a very important play that kind of captured, of course, the spirit of this age. The popular movements and what each group was trying to achieve. Now, of course, this party is going to disintegrate when William Jennings Bryan quit. And by 1900, again, the third party, this Populist Party, the People's Party, had disbanded. It had disintegrated. We might think that, again, this got really nowhere, that third parties in the United States have played no significant role in U.S. politics, etc. But the exact opposite is true. Okay, when we look at the third parties, the function of third parties in the United States, political scientists now go back and see that third parties have played a very important role in bringing about change, because very often third parties are formed by people that are not necessarily represented, or they don't feel integrated into the mainstream politics, that is to say. So in many cases, when people don't feel so much representation, what happens is that they start really forming a grassroots movement. Grassroots movement is a movement from below, that is to say, that is attempting to bring about certain changes in the system, positive changes for the most part. So, in the end, those movements end up forming a political party. It's a third party. And what happens is that since in the United States we have always had a two-party system, therefore a third party, whenever a third party is formed and a third party is growing, it makes the two parties pay attention to the needs of the people that are following that party. And that party, as that party grows in popularity, the two main parties have to look around and say, well, we better pay attention to what they're saying, because something that they're saying is important, so much so that it's attracting a lot of people. And if we don't pay attention to that, and if we don't actually do anything about that, then this party can become a major political force at some point, and they can become a true competition, in other words. So what the two parties actually end up doing, and this is something that we have seen over and over again in the United States, is that the way that they try to solve this problem of competition that the third parties represent is by adopting and borrowing, appropriating some of their ideas into their own parties and trying to actually use them to actually divert people away from that party into the two main parties. But that party will have to now do something about that policy. It has to implement it. It has to pass it into law, that is to say. Because if it doesn't do that, then this third party will simply continue to grow. And it will grow. I mean, that's a fact. Again, it will just simply grow. It will continue to grow and grow if it's ignored. If it's totally neglected, again, things that really matter to people, okay, things that really affect people's lives can be used as certain ideas to form political parties, okay? So this is exactly what the populists are going to do, is that some of the ideas of the third party, this populist party, the People's Party, are going to be appropriated by the two main parties, but they're also going to be appropriated by a third social group that is going to now use certain ideas of the populists in order to create their own movement. And this, of course, is leading to the progressive movement of the middle class. The populist movement of farmers and workers inspired the middle class to say, well, if we don't really become active ourselves, the middle class that is, then what's going to happen is that the farmers and the workers will continue to be dominant in politics, in grassroots politics, to the point that they're going to be the ones actually implementing all of the reforms in the United States. So in reality, what this party did, particularly the election of 1896, is really tell the middle class, well, you have to now do something, of course. And the middle class, of course, is paying attention and saying, yes, we do have to do something, because the middle class feels that they do have the skills, they have the intellectual preparation, the intellectual development to actually articulate, the ideas, the problems of the country in a more global way. That is to say, so we can actually present a wider vision that can actually include, of course, solutions that will actually, solve the problems, that will attend the problems, not only of a specific group of people, but everybody, as a whole. So again, the middle class is now stepping up to the plate. It was largely inspired by the populists, and now we're going to see the rise of the progressive movement from 1890 to 1920. We're going to see now the middle class, of course, now becoming far more active, again, in trying to, now they take the lead in bringing about reform, bringing about change, and not just letting the farmers and the workers do that. In other words, that now the middle class is also going to now participate again in those popular movements, and also become quite politicized, create their own organizations and the like to bring about change. So let's look at now the problems of the middle class. Okay, the problems of the middle class. Just like we looked at the problems of farmers, the problems of workers, and how they became organized, etc. So likewise, we have to look at the problems of the middle class. The middle class was also facing certain problems that of their own that convinced them that change was needed, that reform was necessary. Okay, and in doing so, of course, they're going to create their own movement that is going to serve as a platform, as a way to address the policymakers, again, senators, congressmen, politicians, again, of the problems that they experience. But at the same time, they're also going to pay attention to the problems of others, like the problems of the working class, the problems of the workers, and they're going to create a more comprehensive program, again, to try to address the problems, again, that everybody was experiencing. But the middle class, because the members of the middle class at this point live in the cities, this is, again, a third group that was born with the Industrial Revolution. Okay, Industrial Revolution gave rise not only to the industrial working class, but also the middle class. A great many of them were, involved in industry, members of the middle class, supervisors, engineers, the administrators, and the like, chemists, scientists, and so on. So they live in cities. They work for industries. They work for enterprises. They work for companies. Many of them own their own companies, their own shops, and so on. In the city, we looked at the rise of the industrial city. Cities back then were not very well built. The way the cities, the new modern industrial city in the late 19th century, the way they were built is that they were built in a very improvised manner. And as a matter of fact, they grew very fast as a result of immigration. Okay, there were many immigrant groups coming from Europe. And as more and more people are pouring into those cities, their cities are growing. So there's not a lot of time to actually plan for building the city, the layouts, the streets, to bring civil engineers, urban engineers, in other words, to really try to build the city in a very organized way. They were just growing, by the year, with more and more people coming in, and more people investing in factories, investing in industries, and the like. So there were, of course, the cities back during this time were not necessarily the best places that you could live. There were so many ills, again, in the cities. They were overcrowded. The typical experience is, first and foremost, they're overcrowded. This is one of the first realizations of anybody walking into any of the cities in the United States, and of course, any of the cities of the industrialized world. Even in Europe, it was the same thing. The witnessing slums, for example, working class areas where the working class people lived, had no services whatsoever, and they were poverty stricken. They looked like, again, what is called today like a slum, for example. There were no systems of wage management. For example, trash collectors or sewage systems, etc. So imagine, everything that we take for granted today in a city that is very well developed, very well planned and organized, and so on, even though there's problems, but they're very, very well organized. Well, back then there were no systems of wage management or sewage system. The slums, they're overcrowded, and of course, that was a perfect breeding ground for epidemic disease, the outbreaks, again, of certain epidemic diseases that were caused by bacteria, of course, microbes that live in the filth, for example, the waste, sometimes even human waste. There were even animals. Of course, people had animals inside of the city, like an animal farm, etc. So they were feces of animals and the like. So, of course, that created the conditions, of course, for the development of bacteria that produces certain diseases in the human organism, like cholera and typhoid. Okay, just a second. And there were outbreaks from time to time in the cities. It was very typical to see that, again, outbreaks of cholera, outbreaks of typhoid. And the reason is, again, the overcrowdedness, the lack of hygiene, the lack of waste management, and so on. So this is something that those that study world history, there's historians that look at world history. For example, the development of cities in world history. This is very typical in cities. And there's always outbreaks, again, of epidemic disease in cities, particularly precisely because of the overcrowdedness factor. Again, this is, again, quite typical to see. Another issue that the middle class witness and is going to complain tirelessly is the issue of political machines. We have been talking about this. There are in every city in the United States a political machine. This is an organization, a political organization that belongs to one of the two main parties. In the South, is mainly a democratic political machine, and in the North, for the most part, is Republican. Okay. So, what a political machine does is it ensures the continuity of the political party in office. So it has a boss. Every political machine in every city has a city boss. It has a boss, and he's not just the boss of that political machine. He's actually the boss of the city because he's the political boss. So therefore, he is the city boss at the same time. He doesn't have to be a mayor. He doesn't have to be an elected official per se, but he is the strongman of the party in that city that runs the machine and pretty much makes the appointment. Okay, well, there's going to be next year, there's going to be an election, and the city boss is going to actually nominate the candidate that will run for office. So the clients, again, the people that work for the machine, for the city boss, in this period of time, became, for the most part, the immigrant groups coming into the United States from Southeastern Europe. Many of them are Italians, for example. They're Polish, Hungarians, Germans. And of course, they are the clients of the city boss because they see in the city boss a strong man. The immigrants see the city boss as a protector, as a father figure. And so the city boss is protecting them, ensuring that the immigrants will have a job. But in return, the immigrants will have to provide also a sort of service, a contribution to the city boss. And of course, that will be working inside of the political machine. Like controlling, for example, supervising elections. Oh, the immigrants are going to be sent into the voting booth, across the city where the people are voting to inform the city boss of who voted against the official candidate, for example. Okay, very typical. So the middle class complains about this because they say, well, I mean, there's no privacy here. Our vote is not, really secret. It's not private, and we're being affected, by the city boss, because the immigrants inform the city boss of what we're doing. So they cannot vote for whoever candidate they want to vote for. And of course, another complaint is that during this time, the city boss is now engaged in running what is called a saloon. There's now the increasing presence of saloons inside of the city. This is a place where people drink, alcohol. There's gambling taking place, and there's also prostitution. So the saloon, this is something that existed in the Wild West, again, in the territories, where there was no law. And this is typical of those Wild West movies, the saloons again, where the cowboys, the outlaws go, they drink, they shoot each other. There's brawls, there's fights, and etc. So something that existed in the Wild West is now coming to the city. And the city boss happens to run the saloons. It runs the alcohol, again, trade, the alcohol industry. It sells the alcohol. It's in charge of prostitution as well. And of course, this led to a whole series of problems in the city: the rise of prostitution, the rise of alcoholism, the rise of domestic violence, for example. It's another ill that the middle class pays attention to, that they would like to reform it. They would like to introduce a secret ballot. So they see that what the populists were talking about, they said, oh, this is great, to have a secret ballot, because then that will give people the privacy to vote for candidates that will have the most merit. They want a merit system. The candidate that is most prepared, most articulate, most honest, whatever, they want to vote for those individuals, okay, based on merit, and not necessarily because they have to. In other words, so secret ballot is good because that's going to better democracy. In other words, make it a better system, elect better leaders, and so on and so forth. They also will be proposing things like prohibition. To do away with those city bosses and their businesses, their saloons. Let's just prohibit the sale of alcohol to get people sober, and we're going to solve that. And we're going to deprive the city boss of this very important business revenue, and with that, we're going to simply, again, reform society, reform the city. We're going to actually clean it up, again, of this type of corruption. And also, they want to set quotas for immigration. In other words, bring about a reduction of immigration, because they understood that those immigrants were simply becoming the clients of the city bosses and kind of adding to the corruption of the city, that is to say. So another thing, of course, that affected the middle class was, of course, monopolies. Again, there's now, during this time, the rise of monopolies in the United States. There's a monopoly means that there's a specific company that dominates an entire industry, whether it's the steel industry or the railroad industry, for example, or oil, and so on and so forth. Again, just one company. So again, what the middle class observes from monopolies is that this is affecting the quality of products that companies manufacture. Because when you have a monopoly, well, there's not a lot of competition. There is no competition. If you only have one company producing products for everybody, well, what is going to incentivize that company in actually trying to improve the quality of the product when it doesn't have any competition? Okay, so it can affect the quality. Of course, when you have no competition, there will be no improvement. And of course, the prices will increase, because when you're not in competition, you can actually fix the price at whatever rate you want to fix it. But when there's competition, we have a multiplicity of companies competing. They're going to improve the quality of the service, improve the quality of the product that they create. They want to offer the better quality of product at the best possible price, because they're all in competition, that is to say. And of course, what the middle class is at the end looking at is that they want to participate in this economy as well, And monopolies don't allow for the middle class to invest again in those industries. In other words, they want a system of what we call shares. For example, today we have a stock market. For example, you can buy a share of a company. You can invest in a company. You buy a share, and you're sharing not only the investment, but you're also sharing, of course, profits if the company does well. So monopolies prevented, of course, the middle class from investing, of course, in the most successful industries in the country. And they want to open up, of course, the economy for investment as well. Okay, so this is what the middle class looks at. Of course, that affects the middle class. Of course, they feel affected, constricted in that way economically, of course. They want capitalism to open up again to the middle class. So the progressives, again, this is going to be the name given to members of the middle class that are now going to become highly active, again, in trying to push for change, for reform. And they're given the name progressives, not populists. Remember, the populist is a political philosophy that says that people, the masses, are the very low rungs of the ladder. Again, the most humble, for example, the common individual, the common person, that person also has a say in the system, has the right to participate in politics, write legislation, and the like. A very popular populist philosophy of direct involvement, again, in the political process, voting on bills and so on and so forth, very direct, in a very direct way. But progressives is a very different philosophy. What the progressives, of course, attempt to do is bring about progress, okay, create the kind of reforms that will allow more progress to take place in the political system of the United States, which is the democratic, okay, to open up for the democratic system to become more and more inclusive, more democratic, free of corruption, and also the economic system. They would like to see, of course, capitalism become more progressive in a way that it will create more opportunities for those that really want to work hard and progress, to remove the constrictions, the limitations of capitalism that are preventing people to attain progress, that is to say. So it's very different. Again, it's a more middle class philosophy. It's not populism, it's a middle class philosophy. It's called the progressives. Social progress. They want to, again, create a society in which there's the conditions, the opportunities for everybody to attain progress. And the progressives were really divided into two different camps. There were the religious progressives, the Christian Protestant missionaries, for example, and reformers that we talked about earlier. People that believe that there is Christ coming very soon. They have this Christian millenarian belief that Christ is about to return, and so therefore they see themselves as Christians that are trying to spread the gospel around the world, convert people to Christianity, and use Christianity to help people. Again, to help people, to help the poor, to help the sick, for example, to change American politics in a way that politicians will be more compassionate. In other words, the politics of compassion was called. Again, this is one type of progressives, the religious progressives that see themselves on a mission, again, to transform society, to reform it, because Christ is coming. So we need to change ourselves, and we need to change society. We need to change humanity. And help the poor, etc. But there's also the other camp of progressives. They're not religious, they're intellectuals, okay, the intelligentsia, okay, they're more scientifically oriented, okay. Those are people that are coming from academia, from universities, from colleges, with degrees, and end up, again, working for companies, for industries, and they're part of the professional class again, highly educated. Some of them own their own business, again, their own shops. They're shopkeepers, for example, as well, a great many of them. And of course, part of this group are also the very highly educated women who are also struggling, fighting to liberate women from all of the restrictions that men had imposed in the past on women, to allow women to express themselves, to vote. For example, the right to vote, women rights to vote, women's right to be hired also and be paid the same wage as men do, for doing the same job, etc. Again, they are trying to push women to become more educated and the like, the feminists, if you will. They're part of, again, of the progressives, if you will. And most of them are more oriented, towards science. They really prefer science as a way to solve social problems, the scientific approach, for example. So they do research, they do journalism, they investigate, again, in different fields of society, and they write. They publish articles, okay? And they do what is called progressive journalism. They publish articles in newspapers, in magazines, for example, in academic journals as well. But in magazines, the magazine of this time was not the tabloid. What people were interested during the progressive era was not about gossip, okay? What people were actually reading were magazines that contain articles written by the progressives, progressive journalism, again, like Everybody's, Cosmopolitan, and McClure. Again, very popular magazines, national magazines in the United States, that were written by actually critics. Those were social critics that were trying to expose certain ills of society, ills of the city, the ills of political corruption, and the city boss, for example, and the like. They were known as the muckrakers. This is the nickname that they went by. The muckrakers, those were the social critics of expose, exposing corruption, ills, epidemics, breakouts, etc., the lack of hygiene that, again, the cities had, etc., and so on and so forth. So again, what the progressives, the progressive journalists, and the progressives as a whole, what they attempting to do is bring about reform. Reform, not necessarily to reform the system in which you're going to simply displace one system and bring another in its place. In other words, they don't want a revolution, okay? What they want is evolution. They want to create the necessary change for society, for human societies to reach the next level of evolution, okay? So is evolution not revolution? Once again, so reform is just remove the obstacles, the constrictions of the system that prevented people from actually developing themselves as humans, as human beings, that is to say. So we can actually express ourselves and reach our full potential. In other words, so we, again, it is necessary to reform our institutions, reforming our political institutions, economic institutions, reforming our society, so we can become more humane. People will become more responsive to human pain, to human need, so we care for one another, and of course more moral at the same time. This is what the progressives, a higher vision, again, in which they said, we can keep capitalism, we can keep democracy, but we just have to reform it in a way that we're going to create a better society, a better capitalist system, and a better democratic system that will foster the growth, the full potential of people, again, so we can become more human, more responsive to one another, and more moral, that is to say. So, again, this is also going to lead to the the formation of a third party called the Progressive Party in 1912. So just like the Populists created their own third party, we're going to see also the rise of a third party system in the United States. It was very short lived, by the way. It will be known as the Progressive Party, made up of particularly, of course, members of the middle class. That also, in the election of 1912, are going to run for the presidency, even though they did not win. Of course, we're going to see a series of objectives or goals that the party pursued, such as, for example, women's suffrage. Okay, the progressives in this party want women's right to vote, the 8-hour working day, something that the labor movement was talking about. They want a minimum wage. The labor movement was talking about that as well. So we see the appropriation of those ideas by the middle class and say, well, this is good because this is going to benefit everybody, not just workers, but virtually anybody. Again, working in the industry, working in a job, 8 hours is the ideal. Time for work in a day. The minimum wage, again, is ideal for everybody. Child labor laws, again, to prohibit child labor. Healthcare as well. Now you're going to see the rise again of that idea during the progressive era as well, providing healthcare to people. Compensation whenever they suffer an accident inside of the workplace. That the employer can compensate for your medical expenses and therapy, surgeries, medicine. And also to care for the environment. There's environmental pollution taking place during this time. Some rivers were polluted, and of course, the progressives saw that the environment also counted, that it was essential to attend the needs again of the environment, to clean the waters and so on, the rivers that were polluted, and so on. So at any rate, we're going to see that there will be also significant push for advancing a series of reforms in the country, the progressive reforms. The movement was growing significantly. It had already created a third party in 1912, so it was essential by both the Republican and Democratic Party, from the city to the state to the national level, to pay attention to the progressives and begin to reform again society, bring about change, in other words, because otherwise this party will continue to grow in the future. So again, it all began with the city, reforming the American city. Okay, the American city will be significantly reformed during this age in terms of having city planning and public health institutions. Okay, there will be civil engineers, urban engineers for planning to build cities in a more organized way, efficient way, and also public health. You're going to have public health officials that are trying to, monitor, for example, outbreaks of disease and so on, try to deal with those crises in various ways and so on. Trying to implement certain regulations for restaurants, for example, hygiene, not to have any animals being slaughtered inside of the patio of a restaurant or the patio of a house, etc. There's going to be blood and feathers and feces, etc. Breeding bacteria. So those kinds of regulations, city codes, as they're called. Again, there's now, of course, the field of chemistry and microbiology assisting public health in trying to control city epidemics. So that's a new tool that the new institutions, they're going to be, of course, geared towards controlling things like cholera and typhoid, again, in the American city. Also creating campaigns for raising awareness, hygiene awareness, and health regulations. Washing your hands, for example, using detergents, antibacterial soaps, and so on. Those kinds of products in order to clean your home or clean places where people eat. so they can be meeting certain standards, again, health regulations and so on and so forth, those kinds of things. Implementing waste management systems, such as sewage and garbage disposals, for example, to clean up the city. The city doesn't have to be, a place ridden with bacteria and filth. They can be the ideal place to live. That was, again, how the progressives saw the American city. This can be, again, the ideal setting for, human development. So what we need is reform it. We need the institutions. We need the structures to make the city run better. Health regulations for public restrooms and the like. Again, all of that is emerging from the progressive era. So there's a major upgrade taking place in the American city as a result of, again, the efforts of the progressives. Many of the articles they wrote, the muckrakers, I talked about that, informed the public for the need, again, of creating those types of institutions. Now, reforming the economy, again, we're going to see also significant change in the economic system in the United States. For example, the progressives are going to be pushing for certain reforms that will improve the industrial capitalist model, okay, this industrial capitalist system, to make it better, make it work for everybody. And one way is that they push for the introduction of anti-monopoly laws in 1990. We're going to see the beginning stages of that with the passing of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, it's an anti-monopoly law prohibiting the practice of monopoly by certain industries and certain companies, that it was forbidden. In other words, it was prohibited. It was illegal. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. So despite the fact that the law was written, it was passed, monopolies continue to exist in the United States for many years to come. So one muckraker, one progressive journalist by the name of Ida Tarbell, did a study on one particular monopoly, the oil monopoly, Standard Oil back then, and wrote a piece called The History of the Standard Oil Company, just talking about monopoly practices and the like, how they still continue in the United States. Of course, it was widely read. It was very popular. And so this led, again, the publication of this piece to the breakup of this monopoly after, of course, the company went to court with the United States. It reached all the way to the Supreme Court. And what was at stake here is whether the company was violating the Sherman Antitrust Act or not. In this Supreme Court case, it reached all the way to the Supreme Court in 1911. The Supreme Court decided that indeed Standard Oil was actually violating the Sherman Antitrust Act. So it had to allow for competition, and it had to, again, allow other companies to exist and flourish. And again, we're going to see, of course, Standard Oil being broken up into 7 different companies, and 35% of each of those companies, the net worth was opened up for public investment. So now the public can actually buy shares from the oil companies, of course, and 35% of each one of those 7 companies will be publicly owned through public investment. That is to say, so again, it kind of transformed capitalism into a more democratic system, because it's now allowing for the investment, the participation, again, of the middle class. And finally, in 1914, another antitrust legislation was introduced called the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914, which finally made it very clear that there will be no more monopolies in the United States, that monopolies are forbidden. In other words, they're illegal and they're unconstitutional. That is to say, so this is the law that's still in place today that prohibits certain companies from actually monopolizing an entire industry. Okay. At any rate, so industry is also going to be regulated as well as part of this progressive reform. In other words, what the progressives also believe is that besides breaking monopolies, that it's also important to regulate certain industries that have a direct impact on the health of the population, like the food industry. So again, this reform, what this means is that the state will have to supervise the food industry and create certain regulations, certain standards of health, that is to say. Okay, so this whole movement towards regulating the food industry came with the publication of a book called The Jungle by a muckraker named Upton Sinclair. That was actually published, this book called The Jungle, in 1906. It was actually a book written about labor, immigrant labor, Europeans coming to Chicago, for example, those slaughterhouses, the meatpacking plants, and the like, and their lives. But there were certain pages devoted to life at the workplace. So he visited, of course, the meatpacking plants, the meat packaging plants, and he was horrified, of course, at the lack of hygiene, the corpses, the rotten meat that lay around in the open, the foul smell, etc. That was so common inside of these meatpacking plants. He wrote about it. And again, the publication of this book led to a movement in the United States to actually create some form of regulatory body, an agency that will regulate the meat industry. It came with the Meat Inspection Act of 1906. There would be inspectors sent to the meatpacking plants to oversee the operations, to make sure that the meat was not poison or toxic, that there will be no toxic fumes, etc. there, bacteria, and the like, to meet certain health standards. And eventually, this led to the creation of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which gave birth to what today is the Food Drug Administration, the FDA, by the way, the FDA. So what this administration is going to do is regulate not just the meat industry, but all industries that produce food, and also medicine. It was called drugs back then. It was actually medicine, pharmaceutical drugs. That is to say, to make sure that they also were safe to consume, safe to eat, safe to take. They meet certain standards. That is to say, forcing, in this case, the food industry to put labels on their food, on their boxes, on their cans, to inform the public of the content, the ingredients, the nutrition labels, the calories and the like, all the breakdown, everything you see on those labels. Again, this came out from those reforms, regulating industry, again, to protect the health of the consumer, protecting consumers, that is to say. This is progressive. This is going to make industry better. We're going to make our food better, in other words. And this is what the progressives are thinking. This is what's needed. Also, workers' rights. It's another type of economic reform. Better the life of workers by providing, of course, compensation. In 1907, there will be a series of laws passed by the states and the federal level, and actually indicating that all employers at the state and federal level will have to be liable to their workers and provide compensation when they suffer accidents. So if you suffer accident inside of a job, the employer will be liable to pay for compensation, medical expenses, that is to say. And also in 1916, another workers' right was the Adamson Act of 1916 that introduced the 8-hour working day as well. Workers' rights, in other words, look, this is going to benefit everybody. It's not just one group of people, but virtually anybody, whether you're working in an office, etc., as a secretary for a company, etc. Doesn't matter, or an engineer, a supervisor, doesn't matter. At every level, 8 hours is very healthy. This is proper. It will benefit everybody. Okay, so you get compensation, and everybody benefits from that, and also, you get the 8-hour working day. So those were part of the progressive, again, reforms that kind of borrow the ideas from the populists. Remember, populism pretty much inspired the progressives to become more active because they were gaining a lot of popularity. The populists, that is to say, that made the middle class pretty much turn around and say, we need to now get active ourselves. The abolition of child labor was the accomplishment of the feminist leaders of the feminist movement, Susan Anthony, Helen Keller, and Mother Jones. They championed also child labor laws to end child labor in the United States. Some of their activism included, for example, leading Children's March in 1903. Mother Jones led one of the largest children's march in history. People marching from New York to Washington, D.C. 284,000 children marched to petition senators and representatives in Washington, D.C. the introduction of a bill that will prohibit child labor in the United States, which finally came in 1960 with the Keaton-Owen Child Labor Act. It actually, again, declared child labor illegal in the United States. But this is the great accomplishment, of course, of the feminist movement that also took on, of course, the challenge to speak for the children of this country as well. Of course, there's also going to be political reforms, reforming the American political system. The publication of a book called The Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Stevens that pretty much talk about the city bosses, again, the political machines, the clients, the client system that I was talking about in terms of the immigrants pretty much serving the city boss, controlling elections and the like, the saloons, the alcoholism and so on. All of that was published by Lincoln Stevens in a book called The Shame of the Cities. It was just like Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. It had a similar impact. It actually brought to light this issue of the city boss and the political corruption and the need to actually make society, make the political system more democratic, to try to end, again, those mechanisms that allow a political boss to control elections, for example. So again, the political reforms were based on the secret ballot. Okay, voting is secret. Initiative is allowing people to initiate a bill, write a bill, and send it to Congress, so people can also write laws. A referendum, allowing people to vote on a bill if Congress wants to include the people and say, we want the people to decide whether they want this or no. Yes or no on certain bill, people can vote. Referendum. And recall. Recall is that you can recall an elected official for misconduct, for corruption. You can actually remove them from office, that is to say, because of corruption as well. So those four reforms attempted to make the democratic system more democratic. Okay, and the redundancy, but again, it's just trying to kind of just cleanse it, clean it, and actually have it, to work more in a more democratic way and more honest. And of course, we're going to see a series of amendments. There will be 4 amendments introduced during the progressive era that reflect the ideals, the aspirations of this generation. Okay, it reflects the philosophy of the progressives. The progressive amendments, as they're called, the 16, 17, 18, and 19 amendments. The 16 is the income tax, again, of 1913 that the labor movement had pushed for. If you recall, the populists also were trying to push for a graduated income tax, again, passed in 1913. The directional election of senators, again, with the 17th Amendment. Senators are now chosen by the people in a democratic way. The 18th Amendment, the prohibition of alcohol, again, prohibiting alcohol was seen as the solution to end the saloons of the cities, to end the corruption of the city bosses, to make people quit drinking, go sober, get to work. In other words, be more productive, healthier, and so on. And also the 19th Amendment was the women's suffrage that finally gave women, of course, the right to vote. women's suffrage. This is the accomplishment of the feminist movement of the 19th century, culminated with the 19th Amendment, the right to vote. So women are now voting, they're participating also in politics as well after 1920. So in sum, what we see then in this topic is that in this transition towards modernity, when many Americans experienced economic and social hardships, as they're transitioning towards this modern age, this modern economy, and they were attempting to make it, succeed, in other words, people form grassroots organizations to help each other overcome the social, economic, and political ills that affected them as a particular group. And the way they attempted to overcome those was through organizing into clubs, organizations, associations, and so on, that can bring about reform. So the key term here is reform. And what we need is change. We need to reform the system to address our problems. The actions of farmers, industrial workers, and the middle class progressives help bring about the transformation of the American industrial city. We looked at how the industrial city was reformed. Again, the introduction of, certain measures like public health institutions, wage management, and so on, so forth. Again, the industrial capitalist economy was also reformed, the breaking up of the monopolies, regulating the food industry, for example, another very important one, workers' rights, the 8-hour working day, compensation to workers, ending child labor, and of course also transforming the democratic political system and bringing about those, again, referendum, initiative, recall, for example, those political reforms that were attempting the direct election of senators, that were attempting to open up the system politically for the participation of a larger group of people. Okay, so with that, we conclude then our topic called Popular Reform Movements. The questions are at the very end of the presentation for you to study, for you to review. This is all I have for you. And after this topic, we're going to actually continue into another topic. We're moving now into the 20th century. We're going to be looking, of course, at the fifth topic, opening up the first session next after this. This is all I have for you. Then I'll see you then in the next episode in the new topic. Thank you.